Good evening, my friends, and welcome to a brand new episode of Terror Radio Podcast. If this is your first time joining me, then welcome. This is a podcast dedicated in bringing you the best of horror and thriller, old-time radio broadcasts, as well as original stories. I'm your host, Keith, aka the Radio Show Nerd, and side note, you've probably noticed that I resorted to going back to the original background music for my theme song, if you will, because I realized the new song I picked was way too loud. Anywho, the title of the episode tonight is Literary Chaos. So, without further ado, this is Terror Radio. The two radio series highlighted tonight are two lesser knowns. The first being Obsession, the second, Sleep No More. Our first radio play is called Solitary Genius and is from the perspective of the great author Edgar Allan Poe. Now, this was first broadcasted on Obsession, September 30th, 1951. Following that are the two short stories, The Woman in Gray and The Mysterious Gift. And these were first broadcasted on Sleep No More, March 20th, 1957. Now, you all know the drill. Sit back, turn down the lights, and listen to Solitary Genius, followed by The Woman in Gray and The Mysterious Gift.
It was the great Byron who wrote, "The holy rood of the mind is far more desired for witness in the play of the Druids than are all the circles of moon fantasy in the forests of moon mist lore. In the fog of the subconscious, there hang great and entwining branches that point strange fingers toward you and seem to whisper in the midnight breeze, 'Art thou a doubter of my work?' You will hear the story of such in a moment when Theodore Osborne creates the role of Edgar Allan Poe in the story of The Solitary Genius, a man surfeited with a black and morbid and horrible obsession. It was again the blind poet Homer who said, "Genius is a state between heaven and hell, and he who shall there reside will neither be understood nor yet have mundane understanding. He will never be forgiven, nor will he heed sup forgiving. He shall always stand solitary and alone, to be scorned yet have no wit for scorning." Such was the precarious estate of the tragic Edgar Allan Poe. Within the whirls and convolutions of his brain, there sprang dazzling flashes of the pure white light of fantasy, and betimes in contrast, there formed eddies and whirlpools and turgid thoughts of black despair and melancholia. He was a man within himself, a man neither understood nor understanding. That is, with but one exception, there was but one beautiful and ethereal light of his existence, the light he immortalized, forever and eternal, in the sweet and pathetic lyrics of Annabel Lee. That was the celestial name he gave to her. Of course, her earthly name was Virginia Clem.
Virginia, darling.
Oh, hello, Edgar. I've been wondering where you were.
If your wonderment can inspire such music, then I beg of you to continue your wonderment, my dear.
Oh,
No, please, don't stop playing. That melody of yours fills this room of our little house until it becomes as the marble halls of Ire.
How many times have I told you about flattery turning my head?
Do you suppose flattery might turn your head sufficiently for me to kiss your lips?
Oh, my dearest, you're so silly and so wonderful, and I love you so.
No, dearest.
Thank you.
You know, Virginia, if love were the only coin of the realm, none could be as wealthy as we. And I would buy you gowns of lace, jewels of the most priceless, and you should live in a palace of Italian marble with 40,001 servants to do your bidding.
Oh, which reminds me, Edgar. The butcher called today asking again about his bill. He threatened to cut off our credit.
Oh, if I were only St. George and that infernal butcher a dragon, how I would thoroughly enjoy skewering him upon my spear. And what did you tell him?
What was it I could tell him? Tomorrow, perhaps the next day, perhaps the day after. I had no money in the house, you know.
Yes, I know. I wonder why poets must always be forced to starve, freeze, and eat cheese and get it like a mouse.
Oh, we shan't always starve and freeze, Edgar. Someday you'll be famous. Oh, I just know it. I'm sure of it.
Yes, you're as sure of it as you are of tomorrow's breakfast.
But, darling, there's no need to become disheartened. There's no reason for us to be unhappy and discouraged. Why, Edgar, look what we have that the others haven't.
Yes. Mildewed linen, moldy bread, and a shack over our heads that even cattle would be disgraced.
We have love, my dearest, and freedom.
Freedom?
Yes. Look, Edgar.
And what?
That bird sitting on that old stump out there. I think it's a raven, isn't it?
Yes.
On the surface, his life is black and ugly, but his soul is free. Oh, the spaces of the heavens belong to him. He can fly under the sun.
But I'll bet he can't write poetry.
No, he can't. But you can. His wings give him flight. But your poetry gives you flight that shall last beyond the life of, that silly old bird.
Yes. Perhaps.
Beyond your life, Edgar, you shall live. And beyond his life, there will be nothing. Your life, our lives, but they shall be forevermore. And his life shall be nevermore.
Nevermore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Virginia, excuse me, I'm going to my room.
You're going to your room?
Yes, to my room. And Virginia, don't disturb me. The raven is going to quote nevermore. And Edgar Allan Poe, in that one word, I promise you, shall live forevermore.
In the frenzy of inspiration, Edgar went to his room, sat at his desk, and pondered head in hands just how he should plan this poem. He did it all rationally with sober reason, not in abandoned drunken madness, as it has been said. His was the frenzy which all poets know, the poetic frenzy of inspiration that drove him on and held his thoughts to their purpose. Thus it was that he planned first the length, then the impression and tone of the poem, planned the refrain, and finally he wrote the last part first, so that he would have some definite entity toward which to build. In this way, Edgar Allan Poe worked in that poor, cheap little house, and so grew those 108 lines of mournful and never-ending remembrance. The Raven.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary
over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while he nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came...
Is some visitor tapping at my chamber door? Only this, and nothing more.
It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Vainly he had sought to borrow from his books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, of the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. But presently his soul grew stronger, and hesitating then no longer, he opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word,
Lenore?
This he whispered, and an echo murmured back the word,
Lenore.
merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all his soul within him burning. Soon again he heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. Open here, he flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore, and perched upon the chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more.
Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, from the nightly shore.
Then quoth the raven, much he marveled, this ungainly fowl, to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. But the raven, sitting lonely upon the door, spoke only that one word.
Prophet raven, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Eden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore.
Quoth the raven,
but that word our sign of parting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door.
Then quoth the raven, and the raven, never flitting, still is sitting just above the chamber door, and his eyes have all the meaning of a demon that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and the soul from out that shadow shall be lifted.
Edgar, darling. Edgar, sweetheart, wake up.
What is it, Virginia? What's the matter?
Nothing's the matter, dearest. But I've just come from the post office, and I brought you a letter. It's from the publisher.
The publisher? The Raven. They bought it. Fame and fortune, my dear. No more moldy bread and cheese that even the mice refuse. Oh, Virginia, my dearest, we're rich and we're... Oh.
What's the matter, Edgar? Darling, what is it? Didn't they buy it after all?
Yes, Virginia. They bought it. Listen.
Yes?
For all rights, privileges, publications, and copies for your poem, The Raven, please find enclosed check in the amount of $10, Virginia. We are rich indeed. Nevermore.
The beautiful Annabel Lee, the sweet chime of music that was to Edgar Allan Poe the very essence of life, died out upon the morning air. And there by the wild sea pounding, and in the presence of heaven's angels, he buried her. Then his footsteps turned, and predestined track led him on to a new and strange experience. In the ancient scroll, it is written that the angel Israfel gives to his chosen only once in 10,000 years the power of vision into the future. Edgar Allan Poe, the chosen of this angel, had caught that prophetic crystal from the realms above, had held it, guarded it in his heart, And now he stands without the portals of the strange and foreboding house of Roderick Usher. In his own words, hear him tell in the flash of genius the most startling narrative that mortal ear has ever caught.
As I approached the ancient domain of Usher, I sensed a peculiar atmosphere, one which had no affinity to the air of heaven, but which reached up from the decayed trees and the gray walls and the silent town, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. And I became aware of a great fracture, or crack, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the town. I crossed the heavy bridge of the moat and went, filled with that ominous feeling, to the ancient portal of the House of Usher.
What do you wish?
I wish to see my friend, Roderick Usher. I wish shelter and warmth. Tell your master that an old friend has come to call, that his name is Edgar Allan Poe.
Very well. You may come in. You will wait here in the hall while I inform Mr. Usher of your arrival.
As the cadaverous servant disappeared into the gloom of the long, vaulted corridor, my gaze wandered to the tomb-like structure of my surroundings. I say tomb-like only to describe the decaying furnishings and architecture in which I felt strangely confined. Ancestral portraits hung loosely and dull within cracked, cobwebbed frames. Grinning masks of armor peered out from the shadows. A great circular staircase wound and coiled like some black, ugly serpent into the reaches of the room.
Poe. Edgar Allan Poe.
Roderick.
Upon my life, I've never been so surprised. Let me look at you. It is you, isn't it? It is Edgar Allan Poe, not some specter come to haunt these halls of Usher.
It is truly I, Roderick. And I think it is only weariness, hunger, and cold which lend me this specter's mask. I hope I haven't intruded.
Intruded? My good man. Well, let me say that no visitor to this house has ever been more welcome than yourself. Oh, but come, we'll not stand here in the draught of the hall. We'll repair to the warmth and comfort of my studio. Will you allow me to lead the way, my friend Edgar Allan Poe? Now, if you will comfort yourself with the fire and the great chair, we'll talk. And I think we have much to say, haven't we?
You have much, and I have little. But tell me, Roderick, how have you been? Have you been well?
Since you've asked, I can only tell you the truth, Edgar. I trust it shan't frighten you or disturb your visit. I fear that I am falling heir to the same sickness which has held my sister in its bondage.
Are you speaking of Madeline? Do you mean to tell me that she's ill?
Oh, yes.
But I can't conceive of illness striking such beauty of both body and soul that is Madeline. The Madeline that I knew.
Life is a strange thing, Edgar. Will you excuse me, please? Yes, come in. Well, Philip, what is it?
I beg your forgiveness for this intrusion, sir.
Yes.
I have just returned from the room of the Lady Madeline, sir.
She is worse? She wants me to come to her?
No, sir. I beg to inform you, sir, that the Lady Madeline is dead.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the lips of the servant of Usher pronounced the dread words, the Lady Madeline is dead. Slowly the great ancestral clock ticked, devouring the minutes and hours that passed in morbid reverie. The bells of the tower still swayed in their half-crazed dance. And I found myself standing with Roderick Usher within the subterranean copper-lined vault that was now the tomb of his lovely sister, the Lady Madeline. Roderick. Roderick.
Yes.
Will you not leave her side now? To gaze upon death too long, my friend, is destructive to the soul of the living.
Yes, I know. But Edgar, I can't believe it. Somehow my mind refuses to accept the truth. This is my sister.
No, Roderick. This was your sister.
Oh, Edgar, please.
Look at me, Roderick, and listen. Life is the end. Death is the start. And only through death may life begin. The survival constructive value of this life is the only medium through which man, civilization, empires may achieve the ultimate of perfection. In the fulfillment of the two cardinal laws of God, birth and death, do we only see beauty in its most perfect form? All things must end, Roderick, before they can begin. And not as consolation, not as condolence, do I say to you that death is the life of everlasting peace and triumph, that before the dawn of that perfect era of creation shall break, before we stupid, infinitesimal minutiae of commonplace episodes shall find the perfect karma of achievement, peace without war, a metamorphosis of death must decay this flesh of the lust and germinate the cell of new life that shall be forever without the pallor of death.
But, Edgar, surely...
These things I know, Roderick. How I know? Why? But I do know them. As surely as I know that as man shall die, so shall civilization. That as the selfish forms of social organization shall fall, so also shall fall the house of Usher. And then, Roderick, then will come the miracle of birth and the phenomenon of everlasting life.
The days wear on, and Roderick Usher, last of the symbolic line that reaches far back into the history of civilization, sinks deeper into his morbid shell. Only his music, the strange, half-mad innuendo of sound that seems to emanate from the depths of his soul, continues on through the murky nights and lurid days to console him. Then, knowing that human companionship alone can hope to break this introverted mania, Edgar Allan Poe breaks in upon the solitary Usher and diverts him from his vigil of lone sorrow.
Roderick. Roderick.
Yes.
You must stop this. You must put an end to this means of self-torture, Roderick. If you don't, you shall go mad. And I shall go mad. Body and soul can't stand it.
Edgar.
Yes.
Edgar. My sister is dead.
And your sister's brother shall also become dead if you don't cease this vigil of wanton self-effacement.
Have you ever heard the voices of silence? Have you ever listened to the words of condemnation echoing from the shadowed corners, from rooms, from hallways? No.
Roderick, don't give way to hysteria.
This is no hysteria. No, I'm not mad, not insane. The voices I've heard were not the mumblings of imagination. I tell you, Edgar Poe, they were real, repeating the same words over and over.
What words?
She is not dead. She is buried alive.
In the name of God, Roderick.
Oh, wait, Poe.
I hear nothing.
Edgar Poe, look as I am looking. See as I am seeing. And if your eyes do not see as mine, then I am truly bereft of reason. Mad, insane.
The door.
Madeline.
Oh, God the Father, Christ the Son.
Madeline.
Roderick, why have you done this to me? Oh,
Madeline.
The body of Roderick Usher fell with a mad shuddering upon the now lifeless corpse of his ceremonied enfolded sister. From that chamber and from that mansion I fled aghast. And suddenly there shot along the path a wild light. And while I gazed, the crack in the castle rapidly widened. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. And there came then, through the brilliance that can come only from catastrophe, a strange and perplexing sight of things to come.
You have been listening to Obsession.
Is Nelson Olmsted. Sleep no more. Sleep no more. Turn down the lights. Sink back in your chair and don't look into the shadows. In the shadows, there may be moving things. Tonight, it may be you will sleep no more. Good evening. This is Ben Grauer introducing tonight's Tale of Terror, told by Nelson Olmsted on the National Broadcasting Company's presentation of Sleep No More. The story of terror can be as simple as a sheeted ghost rattling chains. It can be a complex and hidden world of horror, lurking in such unholy dimensions as only the dead and the moonstruck can glimpse. Or it can be those terrible, fathomless shadows which lie buried deep in the primitive mind of civilized man. And for this evening, well, Nelson Olmsted, tell us about this evening's story.
Thank you, Ben. Some time ago, a listener wrote asking me to do a particular story which I told a number of years ago. Frankly, I was surprised she could remember so well. But the story is like that. I've never been able to forget it myself. And I'd like to tell it to you again tonight as our first offering. This is the story of a man who thought he could hate people with impunity. Written by Walker G. Everett, it's entitled The Woman in Gray. Bill was at a dinner party at the Carters when the subject first came up, a dinner to which he would never have gone if he could have thought of a single plausible excuse. Sarah Carter had a girl visiting her from the East, her school roommate or something, Bill thought vaguely. Bill was her dinner partner. They were talking about some people she didn't like, and she said, yes, and they told it all over town that I was the girl who was caught in the raid and that I had a red wig on so nobody would know me. Oh, how I wish I could get even with them, the most hateful people. Now, haven't you any suggestions? Bill looked pensive. Many martinis had set up a pleasant buzzing in his brain, and everything in life seemed very easy, and he said, well, you might tell everybody that they have a repulsive daughter hidden away that nobody ever sees, and that's why they don't like young men calling at the house. No, that's too easy. They have 3 daughters, all repulsive, only not hidden away. That is, yet. In that case, I don't know. Well, why don't you just leave it to me? What do you mean? Do you make little wax images and stick pins in them? Ah, there she'd stolen a march on him, because that was just what he'd been going to say. So he took a piece of celery, applied his mental spurs to himself, and came out in an inspiration. Oh, haven't I ever told you about the lady in gray? No. Who's she? Just the lady in gray. Well, where is she? Right here beside me now. Where? Oh, you can't see her. I'm the only one that can see her, but she's right here by me all the time. I've known her for years. Goodness gracious. Aren't you scared? Doesn't she haunt you? Oh, no, she likes me. That's why she stays here. Isn't it, lady? He turned and nodded to the imaginary figure beside him. Well, of course, she's very modest and goes out of the room when I'm undressed, but all the rest of the time she's here. Even her face is gray. Well, doesn't she do anything at all? Certainly. She gets after people I don't like. How terrible. Well, sick her on the quarries in Hartford, Connecticut, then, and tell her to do her worst. I will. Right now. Do you hear that, lady in gray? Hartford, Connecticut. Quarry's the name. The third house from the corner to the left. I don't want any mistake.
Oh, she never makes a mistake, said Bill. He was rather pleased with his little joke as he finished the last of his martini. That was the last Bill thought about it for 2 weeks, until Sarah Carter plowed across the room at a cocktail party and said, "Now, what's this all about the lady in gray?"
Well, I don't know, said Bill. What do you mean?
I had a letter from Elsa. She said to tell you your lady in gray did the work a little too well, and you'd better be careful.
Hmm? What else did she say?
Something about a family named Quarry. They had an automobile accident, and all died. 5, I think.
Oh. Wow, what a coincidence. And what a story.
He lost no time in telling it around, of course. It was a good story, with enough of pleasant actual horror in it, but not too much. The Quarries remaining mythical, so that it was worth a chill and a laugh any place. Two weeks later, he was at a dinner at Corinne Gorman's house, a fine, old-fashioned dinner, with old-fashioned cocktails before, and new-fashioned highballs after, and good old-fashioned screaming all the way through. Bill sat by Corinne. She turned to him and pointed to 2 empty seats. "Oh, I could kill those people," she said. "They're always hours late anyway, and finally they phoned from Winnetka that they've broken down. Now, why don't you sick your lady in gray on them for me?"
Well, I would, but I don't hate them. I don't want them to turn over like the Quarries.
How well do you know them?
Not very well.
Well, I can tell you some things. They've named their children Peggy Jean and Michael Peter. They have some name for their car, and they go to the circus every year and laugh and eat Cracker Jack and peanuts. That's the kind of people they are.
Oh, well, I'd just as soon hate them for myself. Sure, I'll send the gray lady after them. Only they'd better look out.
That was the last they thought about it until the dinner was nearly over and Corinne was called to the telephone. She came back white. "It was they," she whispered. "Terrible accident. A taxi hit them. Don't tell anybody for a minute."
Oh. Were they badly hurt?
"Yes." He wondered suddenly if he ought to say anything about the absurd conversation regarding the lady in gray. He decided not. 2 coincidences were just a little too much. Yet he knew there was nothing in it. Hadn't he made her up out of a clear sky just to amuse a guest of Sarah Carter? But just the same, he felt it would be a little smart alecky to allude to it. However, Corinne soon saved him the trouble, and she said, "Never mention that gray woman again. Never, never."
Oh. Well, that didn't have anything to do with it. You know that.
"Yes, but it's a little too strange, that's all. As if Santa Claus should suddenly come down the chimney."
Or you find a baby in a cabbage.
"I think that would be a great improvement. But this isn't any time to be funny." But the story leaked out, and Bill's Lady in Gray became even more famous. "It's the funniest thing," people said. "Somebody ought to send it into the New Yorker. And Bill is such a scream about it. He's afraid to hate anybody now, he says, for fear she'll get after them. And he's going to rent her out to the government if we ever get into a war." But Bill didn't think he was funny. He thought this, while not exactly playing with fire, was at least in bad taste. He didn't think he was in very good taste, anyway. For about this time, he had a bad week. 7 nights of drinking and running around town and cashing checks all the time with a low, wormish feeling of approaching reckoning under the talking of nightly parties to get over yesterday's hangover. And every day, down at the office, getting blearier, going to the water cooler with the aspirin bottle in his hand and standing blindly in the window when the terrible 11:30 nausea swept over him in waves. But he didn't know what to do, because life didn't have much meaning anyway, and he was having a better time than most people. One warm night, it was the next Monday, he sat in his room alone. The window was open on blackness. The curtains were limp. His electric fan turned its flat face wearily from side to side, stirring up an ineffectual commotion in the air. The phone rang. It was the doorman who said,
"Mr. Jacobson to see you."
"Tell him to come up."
What could he want? Gibson from the office, unctuous and self-righteous. Why, I hardly knew the man. The doorbell buzzed. "Come in." "Good evening. Good evening." Jacobson came in and sat down. "Well,
Warm, isn't it? Yeah, terribly. You probably wonder why I'm here. Jacobson's mouse-like eyes took in the empty highball glass, the bowl of melted ice. Well, yes, I do. You want a drink? No, thanks. No, I never touch it. Oh, okay. What I wanted to see you about is this. Mr. Selfridge asked me to have a little talk with you, a friendly chat, merely, between friends. Yes. It's about your work. A word to the wise, as it were. Oh? Have I been lying down on the job? Am I going to get the gate? Oh, no, not that. But the first, perhaps, a trifle. A little too many parties, eh? Yeah, Mr. Selfridge thought that just a quiet tip from a friend. I see. Thank you. Oh, not at all. It's a pleasure. Yes, I don't doubt it. Oh, well, I didn't mean that. Well, I'll be running along. Jacobson got up. Nice little place you got here. Yes, I like it. Oh, he hated the man. Why didn't he go? Well, I better go. I got a new convertible downstairs. I have to go slow, and it'll take me a while. I live in the suburbs, you know. Oh, you do? How do you like it? Oh, it's a fine little bus. Yeah, you can see it from the window. I'll look out. Good night. Good night. See you tomorrow. That lug in his convertible, thought Bill. I wish. He went to the window and looked out. Presently, Jacobson came out, climbed into a little yellow car, started out, and drove straight into the side of a big truck that had swung around the corner with a horrible ripping and blasting noise. After a long time, Bill whispered, No, it can't be. He waited until he saw people like sudden ants flocking, and then he came back, poured himself a drink, and sat down on the couch. It had happened again. And just after being told all that about his job, everything he did seemed to be wrong, and it was all his own fault. He gulped down his drink and made another, stronger. The light seemed so bright, made the room look so empty, with only those two black holes of windows. So he turned them out and sat in the single ray that came from the bathroom. When the lights were out, the room changed. The black windows became gradually a soft, warm blue, like a promise of day to come. It was the room that was dark. But Bill just sat there a long time without moving. Finally, he put his hands over his eyes and whispered, I hate myself. Then the door opened, and in came the lady in gray. Now, it wasn't anyone dressed up to frighten him, or a sister come to call. It was the lady in gray, and Bill knew it. He looked at her steadily as she came nearer, quietly, delicately. He felt his brains run down the inside of his skull like melting drugstore ice. The room started to rock and then swirl faster and faster. Finally, she was halfway across the room, and he threw his glass at her. It smashed against the opposite wall. Bill stood up and whirled around. The whole room was swinging in a grayish haze. He turned to the window. They found him the next morning on the second-floor fire escape, one of those horizontal ones with a weight on the end. He had landed almost in the middle and was doing a ghastly little teeter-totter.
A ghastly little story, too, Nelson Olmsted. I can understand now why your listener was never able to forget the woman in gray. But what is your second story tonight?
It's a story by Algernon Blackwood, Ben, a name in modern short story literature that is synonymous with a particularly frightening kind of narrative. Blackwood writes with a weird sincerity about the spirit world and the supernatural. This tale we're about to hear is a masterful one, about a man who suddenly finds himself irrevocably involved in a crime of which he is innocent. It's a story of suspense called A Suspicious Gift. Blake had been in very low water for months, almost underwater part of the time, due to circumstances which he was fond of saying were no fault of his own. And as he sat writing in his room on the third floor back of a New York boarding house, part of his mind was busily occupied in wondering when his luck was going to turn again. In the daytime, he was a reporter on an evening newspaper of sensational and lying habits. His work was chiefly in the police courts, and in his spare hours at night, when not too tired or too hungry, he wrote sketches and stories for the magazines that very rarely saw the light of day. On this particular evening, Blake sat scribbling by the only window that wasn't cracked. His thoughts kept wandering to food, beefsteak, and steaming vegetables. He pulled himself together and again attacked the problem. As he did so, there came a gentle knock at the door, and Blake started. The knock was repeated louder. Now, who in the world could it be at this late hour of night? And he said, "Come in." The door opened in response, and the man came in. Blake didn't turn around at once, and the other advanced to the center of the room, but without speaking. Then Blake knew it was no one from the boarding house and turned around. He saw a man, about 40, standing in the middle of the carpet, but standing sideways so that he didn't present a full face. He wore an overcoat buttoned at the neck, and on the felt hat which he held in front of him, fresh raindrops glistened. In the other hand, he carried a small black bag. Blake gave him a good look and came to the conclusion that he might be a secretary or a chief clerk or a confidential man of sorts. There was something singular about this man, something far out of the common, though for the life of him, Blake couldn't say what it was. The fellow was out of the ordinary and in some very undesirable manner. He spoke in a quiet, respectful voice. "Are you Mr. Blake?" "I am." "Mr. Arthur Blake?" "Yes." "Mr. Arthur Herbert Blake?" "Well, that's my full name. Won't you sit down, please?" The man advanced with a curious sideways motion like a crab and took a seat on the edge of the sofa. He put his hat on the floor at his feet, but still kept the bag in his hand. "I come to you from a friend who wishes you well." "A friend of mine?" "Just so. A friend of yours." "A man or a woman?" "That I cannot tell you." "You can't tell me?" "I cannot tell you the name. Those are my instructions, but I bring you something from this person. I am to give it to you, to take a receipt for it, and then to go away without answering any question." Blake stared very hard. The man, however, never raised his eyes above the level of the second china knob on the chest of drawers opposite. What have you got for me, please?" By way of answer, the man proceeded to open the bag. He took out a parcel wrapped loosely in brown paper. When at last string was off and the paper unfolded, there appeared a series of smaller packages inside. The man took them out very carefully and set them in a row upon his knees. They were all $100 bills. "There are $10,000 here, and they are for you." "What? 10,000? 10,000? Are you sure? I mean, what, you mean they're for me?" He felt quite silly with excitement and grew more so with every minute as the man maintained a perfect silence. Was it a dream? He couldn't believe his ears or his eyes. Yet, in a sense, it was possible. He had read of such things in books, the generous philanthropist who was determined to do his good deed and to get no thanks or acknowledgement for it. Still, it seemed almost incredible. His troubles began to melt away like bubbles in sun. He thought of the landlady and the arrears of rent, of regular food and clean linen and books and music, of the chance of getting into some respectable business, of as many things as it's possible to think of when excitement and surprise fling wide open the gates of the imagination. But, side by side with the excitement caused by the shock of such an event, Blake's caution was beginning to assert itself. It all seemed just a little too much out of the likely order of things to be quite right. The police courts had taught him the amazing ingenuity of the criminal mind, as well as something of the plots and devices of which the unwary are beguiled into the dark places where blackmail may be levied with impunity. The only weak point in the supposition that this was part of some such proceeding was the selection of himself, a poor newspaper reporter, as a victim. It did seem absurd, but then the whole thing was so out of the ordinary, and the thought, once having entered his mind, wasn't so easily got rid of. Blake resolved to be very cautious. The man, meanwhile, though he never appeared to raise his eyes from the carpet, had been watching him closely all the time. "If you will give me a receipt, I'll leave the money at once." He said this with a touch of impatience in his tone, as if he were anxious to bring the matter to a conclusion as soon as possible. But, now, wait a minute. You say it's quite impossible for you to tell me the name of the well-wisher or why he sends me such a large sum of money in this extraordinary way? The money is sent to you because you are in need of it. It's a present without conditions of any sort attached. You have to give me a receipt only to satisfy the sender that it has reached your hands. The money will never be asked of you again. Well, suddenly, it flashed across Blake's mind that if he took the money and gave the receipt before a witness, nothing very disastrous could come of the affair. It would protect him against blackmail, if this was, after all, a plot of some sort with blackmail in it. Or, in case the man were a madman or a criminal who was getting rid of a portion of his ill-gotten gains to divert suspicion, there was no great harm done, and he could hold the money till it was claimed or advertised for in the newspapers. I'll take the money, he said. Although I must say it seems to me a very unusual transaction. And I'll give you such a receipt as I think proper under the circumstances. A proper receipt is all I want. I mean by that a receipt before a proper witness. Perfectly satisfactory. Only it must be dated and headed with your address here in the correct way. Well, Blake could see no possible objection to this, and he at once proceeded to obtain his witness. The person he had in mind was a Mr. Barkley, who occupied the room above his own, an old gentleman who had retired from business and who, the landlady said, was a miser and kept large sums secreted in his room. He was, at any rate, a perfectly respectable man and would make an admirable witness to a transaction of this sort. Blake made an apology and rose to get him, crossing the room in front of the sofa where the man sat in order to reach the door. As he did so, he saw for the first time the other side of the visitor's face, the side that had been always so carefully turned away from him. There was a broad smear of blood down the skin from the ear to the neck. It glistened in the gaslight. Blake never knew how he managed to smother the cry that sprang to his lips, but smother it he did. In a second, he was at the door, his knees trembling, his mind in a sudden and dreadful turmoil. His main object, so far as he could recollect afterwards, was to escape from the room as if he noticed nothing, so as not to arouse the other suspicions. The man's eyes were always on the carpet, and probably, Blake hoped, he had not noticed the consternation that must have been written plainly on his face. At any rate, he had uttered no cry. In another second, he would have been in the passage when suddenly he met a pair of wicked, staring eyes fixed intently and with a cunning smile upon his own. In the mirror, the visitor was calmly watching his every movement. He tore upstairs, his heart in his mouth. Barkley must come to his aid. This matter was serious, perhaps horribly serious. Taking the money or giving a receipt or having anything at all to do with it became an impossibility. Here was crime. He felt certain of it. He reached the next landing and began to hammer at the old miser's door as if his very life depended on it. He got no answer. Turned the handle and walked into the room, and to his immense relief, he saw the old man lying asleep in the bed. Blake opened the door to its widest to get more light and then walked in quickly. Something clutched at his heart as he looked closer. He stumbled over a chair and found the matches. Calling upon Barkley the whole time to wake up and come downstairs with him, he blundered across the floor and lit the gas over the table. In the full glare, he saw the old man lying huddled up into a ghastly heap on the bed, his throat cut across from ear to ear. And all over the carpet lay new dollar bills, crisp and clean like those he had left downstairs, and strewn about in little heaps. For a moment, Blake stood stock still, bereft of all power of movement. The next, his courage returned, and he fled from the room and dashed downstairs. He reached the bottom and tore along the passage to his room, determined at any rate to seize the man and prevent his escape until help came. But when he got to the end of the little landing, he found that his door had been closed, and he seized the handle, fumbling with it in his violence. It felt slippery and kept turning under his fingers without opening the door, and fully half a minute passed before it yielded and let him in headlong. At first glance, he saw the room was empty and the man gone. Scattered upon the carpet lay a number of bills, and beside them, half hidden under the sofa where the man had sat, he saw a pair of gloves, thick leather gloves, and a butcher's knife. Even from the distance where he stood, the bloodstains both were easily visible. Dazed and confused by the terrible discoveries of the last few minutes, Blake stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed and unable to think or move. Unconsciously, he must have passed his hand over his forehead, for he noticed that the skin felt wet and sticky. His hand was covered with blood. And when he rushed in terror to the looking-glass, he saw that there was a broad red smear across his face and forehead. Then he remembered the slippery handle of the door and knew that it had been carefully moistened. In an instant, the whole plot became clear as daylight. and he was so spellbound with horror that a sort of numbness came over him, and he came very near to fainting. At this moment, there came a loud knocking at his door. It was the police, and all Blake could do was to laugh foolishly to himself and wait till they were upon him. He couldn't move. He stood face to face with the evidence of his horrid crime, his hands and his face smeared with the blood of his victim. And a voice, which he knew very well, said, "Here it is, 3rd floor back, and the fellow caught red-handed." It was the man with the bag leading in the 2 policemen. Hardly knowing what he was doing in the fearful stress of conflicting emotions, he made a step forward. But before he had time to make a second one, the 2 policemen moved up to seize him. His only thought was that there was nothing he could do. Nothing he could do.
You can turn up the lights now. You can look around you. Nobody is there, really. Everything is all right, isn't it? Thank you, Nelson Armstead, for 2 exciting stories. The Woman in Gray by Walker G. Everett and The Suspicious Gift by Algernon Blackwood. Now, what about next week?
Well, Ben, next week I plan to present 2 stories which I think you will like very much. One is a narrative which has popped into my mind at the oddest and most unexpected moments. I've never been able to forget it. I've even tried to imagine what I would do under similar circumstances. It concerns a man who made a fantastic wager. He bet that for $2 million, he could spend 15 years in solitary confinement. Would you do it? Anton Chekhov writes a vivid story about the bet. Our second tale is by George Moore, entitled The Clerk's Quest. The human mind is universally enigmatic. Like fingerprints, no 2 form the same pattern, and no 2 run the same course of emotion. Because of our ignorance as to the operation of the human mind, great writers have been fascinated with the subject. George Moore's story is an example. It concerns a poor bank clerk who smells perfume on an envelope, and because of it falls disastrously in love with a woman he never sees. Be with us next week. May I add just a word of thanks for your letters. We are immensely pleased that so many of you have taken the time to write. Thank you for your interest.
You have been listening to Sleep No More, an NBC Radio Network production directed by Kenneth McGregor. Mr. Armstead's albums are recorded exclusively for Vanguard Records. Until next week, when Nelson Armstead will again be here in person, this is Ben Grauer bidding you good night.
NBC takes you across the nation, around the world, with news on the hour and the exciting hotline service. All day, every day, on most of these NBC radio stations.
Well, that's our show for tonight. I want to thank you all for listening. And remember, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/terror1970, or you can find me on Instagram at Radio Show Nerd, or on Blue Sky at Terror Radio. I also have a YouTube channel. Please check it out. Like and subscribe. Share the videos. It will be highly appreciated. Again, this is your host, Keith, better known as the Radio Show Nerd, signing off.